Great, thank you, Jerry. Appreciate the introduction. And I'm really glad to be joined by Jake today. He has been a great resource since he joined our team, lots of experience. I'm really kind of excited to see how he delves into this topic. And, I'm a little bit surprised at how many people have registered and joined for this topic. Because I thought initially it's like, hopefully we'll get maybe 5 people, maybe 10, because, we're talking about the intricacies of legal citations, and it's such an exciting topic. But really, I think there's a lot of interest in this actually, in seeing how this is done, and so I'm kind of excited to actually delve into this. So with that, welcome, Jake. And just a quick note about kind of what our plan is today as far as the agenda. Just give you a quick rundown about who we are in case you haven't heard of Zasio before, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So we've got some good background information on the citations, kind of what they are, give you some examples there. Then we'll jump into kind of how we do it, the sources, sifting through the information, normalizing and formatting, and the kind of problems that you run into just naturally. So, and we'll leave some time also for some Q&A at the end. And be on lookout. We've got a couple of questions that we're going to throw to the audience. So don't get your screen lost in behind your email or whatever it might be. We've got some things that will involve some audience participation. So with that, let me just briefly mention who we are in case you haven't worked with us before. We are Zasio, so it was founded by Kevin Zasio in 1987, so we've been at this for a long time. And Kevin created the first full lifecycle records management software back in 1987, meaning that it tracked boxes and files and documents from start to finish. It was the first one of its kind, and so we're kind of proud of that. Started in the Bay Area, we moved to Idaho in the early 90s. We've been here ever since. And in that same kind of time frame, the early 90s, is when we first launched the consulting division. And with that, the legal research database as well, kind of developing that legal research for the consulting division. So yeah, we've been at this for a while. But throughout that process, we haven't just stayed stagnant. We've been continuously innovating and developing software, developing our tools and our processes to really perfect that process. And that's really all we do. That's kind of the niche that we're in. That's our world. So with that, let's talk a little bit about kind of the background of what we're going to be talking about and how our experience plays into that. I did a little bit of statistics gathering to think, man, what have we been doing since 1995 in this, in this space? And just counting up some of the numbers that you can see on the screen here, over 160,000 citations, and those are just the ones that we decided were relevant, that we keep in the database and we keep updated. There are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more that we looked through and decided, okay, they're not quite relevant, but we have to sift through a lot of information to get all of that detail in the database. And as you can see, that covers 235 jurisdictions. So that's mostly that many countries, but some, as in the United States, have a number of states or provinces. So there's some jurisdictions that kind of get expanded there, but still that covers a lot of territory. And then this was actually a surprise to me, over 58,000 distinct regulated parties, meaning the people who actually have to follow the laws, getting down into the nitty gritty of not just, employers, but what kind of employers or what kind of details are you handling. And so we really make a lot of distinctions there. And then finally, you can see 81 different business categories. And really what that means is you don't have to know all of the specific keywords of a law or regulation. You can search by these categories. So it's, if it's about tax, if it's about, employer laws, whatever it might be, we've already done some of that sifting for you to make that searching process easier. So even with all of that information, all of that data, all of that history, I know that people now are saying, well, okay, but is that really necessary? Because we've got the internet, right? It can search everything. We've got AI now, so that's just, that's the easy button, right? How hard could this be? So that was one of the first things that we wanted to tackle, is just like, okay, is that still relevant? And what are the tools out there that can make your job easier? And is it really practical to be actually doing this? So that's the first thing that we're gonna tackle, is just kind of answering that question about how hard could this be, and what can you do with just generally available tools on the internet. So before we do that, let's just make sure that we're on the same page and talk about really what is a citation. What is the stuff that we're talking about, so we know what it is that we're dealing with. So Jake, I'm going to let you kind of expound your knowledge of that, or expound to us what you know about that, and describe that for us.
Thanks a lot, Warren. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this. Like you said, it's a very specific topic, but I think it's really something that's fascinating. And I think it's important when we talk about a citation. The word citation can be used in a lot of different contexts. In the legal world, it's usually specifically referred to the reference to a different legal source or a different source in a brief or something of that nature. And here at Zasio, when we talk about citations, we're talking about a summary of a law, a rule, or regulation that concerns record keeping promulgated by governmental or non-governmental organizations that is aligned with the operational and jurisdictional scope of specific regulated parties. That's a long kind of way of saying it. We're talking about having references to specific record keeping citations that are relevant when you're talking about your specific business practices. So while this can be used, the word citation can be used in a lot of different ways. This is the way we use it when we're talking about it today. We're talking about that refined reference that allows for stakeholders to be able to quickly judge whether or not this law could be applicable to their situation.
And as I understand it, one citation does not equal one law, right? It's not a one-to-one relationship. You could have multiple citations to a single law because different parts of the law might be relevant and other parts not, right?
That's exactly right. Even within sub parts of a law, there can sometimes be multiple citations that come from that because, as we'll talk about later, there's a lot of different aspects that go into record keeping citations. It's not just the length, but it's also the way, the place. There's a lot that goes into it. And so you can have one brief law that will create multiple citations based on all of those different factors that are relevant for record keeping.
Great. Okay. Well, let's actually take a look at an example of a question that kind of leads to looking into the law, because that's really what this is about, right? We're not just, looking at laws for law's sake. We're trying to answer a question, trying to make business decisions. So, like in this case, how long do I need to keep payroll tax records in New York? It's a valid question if you're in the state of New York, if you're an employer. So Jake, I know that you know the answer to this because, for one, you're a lawyer, you do this for a living, but also you did some research on this. But before I let you answer that, we're going to ask the audience if they know the answer to that with a quick user poll. So let me pull up a poll that you can actually go and see and answer for yourself. So I'll give everyone a few moments to take a look at that, and we'll see if anyone gets that right or how many of you get that right. We've thrown in some little twists there just to challenge you, but we'll see. Of course, this won't be fair if you are actually in the state of New York. You'll probably know this. So if you're on the other coast or somewhere in the middle, you may not know the answer to this, but we'll just see how this plays out. All right, we've got a pretty good majority of people who have voted, and we'll see. And we've got some, I think, that have it right. No one has been too far tricked yet. All right, looks like we've got a majority, so I'm going to close the polling here in just a couple seconds. I like to get it up to at least about 75%. All right, so let's go ahead and close that, and we will share the results. So here you can see that the majority of people said 7 years. Like 7 years is always the magic number, right?
Yeah, that's usually a safe bet.
Exactly. And we had a number of people that said 4 years as well, and then a small amount that said 3. Now, nobody, actually, I take that back. 2% of the people did do 42 years, and hats off to those people. You may have caught the reference, which is the answer to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy about what is the answer to, what is it?
The meaning
Life
of life. Yeah,
the
the
meaning
meaning
of
of
life and
life.
everything, it's 42.
Yeah,
Yeah, the answer is
yeah.
42. So just in case you were wondering where that came from, just a little trick part of that question. But now let's go ahead and take a look at the real answer. And so I will close that poll.
And the
And
answer we have is 3 years. So we're all done. We can all go home. This is a great
yeah, we're done.
webinar. We're
Yeah,
done.
we've got the answer.
No, and I think what's important to talk about, we're going to talk about this. This question specifically and this specific citation throughout. And I think an important caveat, Warren, is that there's always reasons to. We're going to show you a citation. We're going to show you what this citation specifically states, but there's always a bunch of different reasons why you may or may not decide to do something different with your record. So the answer of 7 is not necessarily wrong. It's just a matter, and 4 isn't wrong. It's just that for our illustration here, we're going to point to a very specific law and highlight the requirement that this law has, and then we will go from there to talk about it more in depth. But yeah, that's a really interesting poll and some interesting results.
Yeah, and of course the real answer, I should say, the real question is how do you get there, right? Because that's kind of what we're talking about today. Is like knowing the answer is great, but knowing you have the right answer, knowing where it came from, making it defensible, that's going to be the real crux of it. So obviously you did some research on this. So in the next few slides, I'm going to let you kind of take it away and talk about some of that research that you did and sort of walk us through that process of what you found there.
Yeah, well, I think the first step that anybody would do is just throw it into Google. That's a lot of times. I mean, to be totally honest, that's usually my first step to try and answer a question like this, is to just throw it into Google, see what you get. So
you don't have a law library behind you where you just
I don't. It's under my desk. It's over here.
Right.
But just to save time. So I think what's interesting is throwing this question, just a natural language question, into Google, and you can see it gets you the result that we were talking about before, the 3 years. And what's interesting about this result, though, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more, is that in looking at, while this is the correct answer for what this retention period could be, you can see that the reference it gives to us is this tax.ny.gov webpage. And while that is it's an official resource from the state of New York, it's not actually a reference to the law itself.
And
it
looks official, though.
Yeah, it looks official, and it definitely is not someplace that you shouldn't go to get some information and background. But I think when you talk about the defensibility of your disposition, especially when you're dealing with the legal department, they're not going to be as persuaded by saying, I got this on the New York website, versus saying, here's the law and here's the language in the law that informs our decision as to why we're doing what we're doing. So I think that's something that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. But essentially, this is a good place to start, but it doesn't give us the bedrock foundation of what a citation is really formed from. And again, we chose a question that we felt like would be fairly accessible and something that we could find very easily. Once you start getting into more complex questions, complex records, complex jurisdiction, or more a smaller jurisdiction, for example, Google very quickly loses this ability to pop up with a bold answer. It takes a little bit more to dig down and find that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example because, like I said, it is pretty cut and dried. It's referencing, what should be a reputable source, a .gov, but yeah, that doesn't go into the full nuance of it. So, of course, now people are going to say, well, what about AI? AI can do much better, right? So let's take a look at an example from that.
Yeah, the only thing hotter on the internet than Taylor Swift is AI, and so what I thought it would be interesting, and I'm not an engineer. Warren can correct me on anything that I've done here, but I just simply pulled up the free-to-use ChatGPT and the Bing Copilot. I put these here so that later, if you're interested in the slides, you can look at them. But I simply asked 2 queries: how long do I need to keep payroll tax records in New York? And then I did a follow-up query, which was, what is the citation for that retention period? It was very interesting because with ChatGPT, the answer that we received is actually, it said it was 4 years. And so based on the citation that we're looking at and what we're talking about today, we kind of consider that an incorrect answer in talking about this specifically. And Bing gave us the same answer as Google, which was 3 years. ChatGPT also is for the version that we were using, it's kind of a closed box. It's a closed system, and their last knowledge update was in January of 2022. So there's a chance that if you ask ChatGPT and it gives you an answer, it may not be the most up-to-date answer. Bing is kind of like Google. It's generated, the Copilot is generated through constant search results. So it kind of puts search results and the language model together to give you a response. And so Bing gave us the correct response, but again, it's cited back to the New York tax website. And it gave a couple other citations, but again, it never really dove in. And even when I asked it specifically for the citation, using that word in this context is to looking for that pinpoint reference, it wasn't able to respond with that.
Yeah, so to summarize, you're saying that it's in ChatGPT, it's got the wrong retention period, it's outdated, and there's no statutory reference. Bing Copilot's a little bit better in the sense that it's more up to date, but still the same two other issues.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really kind of surprising because you'd think that both of those would be even better than the Google answer, given that they're intelligence, or at least artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
That kind of surprised me. So given that we've kind of done that little background here and kind of seen how some of those internet tools work and how less than perfect it might be, let's talk then about kind of what the typical process is outside of that, or maybe in addition to, because now those maybe just become tools that we use in addition to kind of traditional research. Let's kind of dig into what our research team goes through, what you go through when you're dealing with this kind of thing. So for that, let's start off with the sources, the regulatory sources. We talked about New York.gov being maybe one type of source, but there's different nuances to that. In fact, that's kind of a good thing to kick it off, and that is the idea of primary versus secondary sources. Maybe you can use that as a way to kick off that topic.
Yeah, I think when you start looking for these types of, when you're trying to answer these types of questions, you're going to find a whole lot of things on it in the internet. You're going to find laws, statutes, administrative rules and regulations, and then you're also going to find blog posts or other aggregators of articles or summaries of laws. And so when we're talking about primary versus secondary, what we're really trying to say is the primary sources are the things that come directly from the governing entity that is promulgating the law. So, for example, we're set in Idaho, and Idaho will put up its Idaho code. It hosts that directly from the legislature's webpage. So when you go there, it has a date, and that's really the authoritative source to finding this information. But other states might outsource that to Westlaw or Lexis or other services to publish their codes. And then you also have administrative rules and regulations, which are also usually promulgated by the states, and they have the same weight and authority of law. But it's just interesting because there's a lot of different components as to what you might be looking at. And again, looking at when you need to have a definitive answer as to why you're doing what you're doing, I think any source is helpful, but the weight of that source varies.
And how do you know, like, whether it is a primary versus a secondary?
I think a lot of times it just comes down to the context of, like, for example, with New York, we'll talk about this in a minute, but when you go to New York's government webpage, it will have a link that says, here's the link you can go to find where our statutes are. So going to the regulatory source that you believe is, going to that source directly and then finding resources on those pages is the best way to find what those sources are. And you can Google that. You can Google, what do I find? Like, actually, it was kind of interesting. I was talking with a researcher. We were looking for, I was trying to find a labor law in Iraq, and it was very difficult for me to find because I kept trying to Google the code section and all these other things. And he said, what I do is I translate it, and then I put the Arabic into Google because that will find the law faster because Google will prioritize what the language you're looking at. So it doesn't think
Yeah.
that an English speaker is looking for an Arabic law, but an Arabic speaker may be. And so there's tricks like that, things that we've learned over years of experience on how to really hunt down and find those primary sources.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next part of this, which is the U.S. citations versus international. You just highlighted one example. Another part is just that we know there are a lot more laws. I mean, over half of our database is U.S. only. So obviously that's been a primary source for us. But what other issues do you run into in terms of trying to find the non-U.S. citations?
I think the biggest thing is just what is actually going to be regulated in those sources. Because, like you said, so many of our citations come from the United States, Canada, Australia, EU. And once you get out of those areas, it's kind of it's really kind of a gamble as to what you're actually going to find that's regulated or not. And so, I mean, you have sections and pages and pages and pages of regulations in the United States on certain industries, and in another country it may only have a couple or none. And so it's kind of a guessing game as to what is actually going to be regulated in those other jurisdictions.
And if it's up to date.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. Great. So I know another big topic that we run into oftentimes is like, the law coming from the government versus different, non-government regulatory bodies, and that's always kind of been an interesting aspect for me. It's like, how do you know if, so let's say FINRA, like the one that we referenced here, how do you know if that's an official source that says you shall keep these records for that long?
Yeah, there's a whole alphabet soup's worth of organizations that govern, and some of them um, they don't have a ton of weight, or they don't put out a lot of regulations or recommendations. But some of them, it's interesting. Sometimes you'll see a law from a state, typically, that references these self-governing organizations and says we are adapting what their recommendations are.
Hmm.
Or a lot of times you'll just see states or jurisdictions adopt those regulations, and so you can kind of know, oh, they're following FINRA because all of their record keeping regulations match the FINRA recommendations. And so it's kind of interesting that way to see how the interplay between those different organizations are sometimes adopted wholesale, sometimes disregarded, and sometimes just referenced. And if you know what you're looking for, you can tell that's where they got it from.
Yeah, so it sounds like some experience plays into that as far as knowing when something is actually used as a defensible source in that case.
Yeah, exactly.
So kind of gets into our last piece, which is, how do you vet the sources? What makes it reliable? How do you know? Maybe you can speak to that briefly.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at where these citations are coming from, where these regulations are coming from, it's always a little bit of a judgment call. But essentially, when you're looking at the completeness and the reliability of a source, the closer you can get to that primary source component is going to be your best bet. And there's a lot of clues when you're looking at those to see, for example, a lot of states and a lot of laws at the bottom will have updated as of this date, or at the beginning of a statutory page from a legislature, they may say all these laws are effective as of X date. And that can be tricky because there's times when laws are changed or modified, and you're trying to make sure that what you're looking at either is in effect or is going to go into effect. We've had laws at times where we know that they're going to be happening in a year even, and so we need to make sure that we note that so that our clients are aware, but also aware that as of today, it doesn't apply.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I can see there's a lot of nuance. Like you said, it's a judgment call in many cases.
Yeah.
It seems like it should be black and white because, hey, it's the law, you do it or you don't, but yeah, a lot of gray areas there.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks on that. Let's go ahead and talk now about, if you find the right haystacks, as we put in that last slide, how do you find the right needles in those haystacks, and how do you know what to look for? So it's kind of like saying, well, we know now where to get the information, but now we deal with the what. What is it that you're looking for? So I know that one aspect of that is about developing queries. So I've talked with several of the consultants about the different types of queries that they run. We've kind of honed those over the years. Maybe you can use that as a jumping off point there, Jake.
Yeah, I think when uh, something that has been really helpful me for being here at Zasio is the breadth of experience that we have in running the same searches and trying to find the same sources to be able to maintain consistency with our research. And I think you're looking for common terms, you're looking for the relevancy of those terms to the laws that you are applying, um, and just knowing that as we're looking for these things and trying to find them, that we're constantly going back to the well of looking for laws and regulations that we found, because as we find those, we kind of bookmark them and go back and say, okay, so has this changed? Is there something additional? Has something been taken away? Another interesting aspect for me about looking at this is the when we're looking at retention versus handling, because there's the how long are you supposed to keep certain records, but then there's also the how are you supposed to keep certain records, because some regulations specifically state the location, even the type of format that it needs to be in, electronic or paper. And so you'll see that throughout various types of laws and regulations, what you're trying to establish. And then there's also, when you're looking at how have these laws been enforced. So you can look at case law, and my experience before this was in litigation. And so in the law, a lot of times you'll have a conflict between two interpretations of a law, and you'll have a court determine what is the correct interpretation or what is the leading interpretation of that. With record keeping requirements, that doesn't happen quite that often. Not a lot of these conflicts make it to that level, but what you do see a lot of is enforcement actions. So you can see where, especially some of these self-governing or self-regulating organizations can influence governmental agencies to enforce, especially in the privacy world. Like, it's huge there, where you're seeing countries enforcing their laws in a way that informs how those laws should be interpreted and how they should go forward.
So would I understand that to say that it's more about worrying about audits and fines than it is about going to court before a judge?
Yeah, because I think a lot of the conflicts that happen at that level, instead of at the we're going to go to litigation over whether or not we should have destroyed this document or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that adds a lot more complexity to the sifting part than I actually realized before, as far as coming up with what actually is relevant and how you decide that.
Yeah. And so on the next slide, we do have an example of kind of the raw statutory text. So keeping back with our example of the payroll taxes in New York, what I did here was I pulled the actual text of the code where we pulled this reference from. And what's interesting here is that you can see that it's in the upper left-hand corner, it's Thomson Reuters Westlaw. And as I mentioned before, New York doesn't host their own code. They outsource it to Westlaw. It's still free to access publicly, but it's just an interesting way that pulls it out. Another interesting point about this is that if you look in the heading, you can see it talks about workers' compensation. So when we answered this question, there's like a general accounting. The 7 years is typically an accounting general question, but sometimes you'll find retention regulations in other statutes or in other applicable to other areas of law that may inform your decisions in keeping certain records, different types of records. So
Yeah, I would have thought this was going to be about taxes.
exactly. And so you wouldn't think that, and then it kind of informs what you're needing to do. So again, all this language is here. I'm putting this up just kind of as illustrative to show how much text, and this is a fairly simple law, but there's times where we have pages and pages of text and you're trying to parse out what's important. And you can see that, for example, subsection D talks about tax records. That's going to come up in a minute. And then lower down, you'll see K, which is records retention. Because I think
Yeah.
what's interesting is if you just only read subsection D, it just says the employer shall maintain all tax returns and forms. And so you say, okay, well, I guess we just have to keep that. We just have to keep it.
Yeah.
And reading further down, K is where you get the actual records retention, where it says for the current calendar year and the preceding 3 calendar years. So that's the way that this pulls itself out, is kind of how that you kind of have to read the whole law together and sift through everything that's here to be able to say this is really what the retention is required.
Yeah, I just used a little highlighting tool to kind of make that point. Hopefully that's easy to see there.
Yeah, because there's a lot of text
Yeah,
that you've got to
swimming.
get through. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. Well, let's kind of spin off of that and talking about, like, what do we do with all that information? Because what you've just shown us really is the kind of the raw data, and we have to take that and put it into some sort of structure. So how do you go about sifting through that and then making sense of it?
Yeah, I think the goal that we have is to make sure that stakeholders and persons who are using these citations can very quickly look at them and get a lot of information and to be able to reference it all together fairly quickly. So for that, we pretty much break these citations down into the same categories of data. So we talk about jurisdiction, we talk about identifiers, which we consider as kind of the headings of the law, where this law comes from, so that you can you can organize it by that and look at the whole breadth of a law from a certain jurisdiction, an area. We talk about the regulated party, which is, Warren, what you talked about before, who this law actually applies to,
Hmm.
the retention period, so the length of time that it needs to be kept. We have various descriptions as to trying to describe what these retention periods, because as you could tell from that prior example, there's a lot of text, and we want to make sure we're trying to thread that needle of explaining what's important without overwhelming with too much information. We'll talk about other requirements that exist in the law. We'll talk about specific triggers that cause certain retention requirements to come into play. Um, and then we'll also include headings and citation text, which is a lot of the details of the law. And I think this is something that typically is not front and center in the citation itself, but that we include in our database so that you don't have to go back and try and hunt down this law on your own if you're referencing it very quickly and just need to be able to look at the text, or legal asks you, can we see what that law says? And you can use that very quickly.
Yeah, so for every citation, you're really looking for all of those pieces and parts to make sure that it's got the things that you need to really use that information, or I should say, make it useful and defensible.
Yeah, exactly. Like with talking about this law for New York, we can go into that and we can break down. If we go to the next slide, I can show kind of how we break all that apart to show the citation. So in the gold box in the bottom, you can see that that's kind of what we will show at the end. That's what our database and versatile retention shows if you pull up this law.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've done is I've taken the header from that prior slide and then the 2 relevant documents, and I'm going to show you how all this breaks down. So in talking about the jurisdiction, you can see obviously that this is the code, the rules, and regulations of the state of New York. So
Mm-hmm.
that goes there. The identifier, like we said, is the specific legal code. This is for the lawyers. This is what you recognize the most, is a series of incomprehensible numbers and letters that with parentheses and all that that signal to the lawyers where to exactly go and find this code itself. And that's also the suffix. Typically, the identifier and the suffix, when you're talking about a legal citation, those are the two things that are put together. And we break them apart so that we're able to, or so that you're able to organize and see by identifier and then drill down a little bit more.
I can see where
Then
that suffix is really helpful if you've got a really long law with lots of different references. You want to get to you don't want to have to read through the entire thing.
exactly. And what's interesting is in a lot of other jurisdictions and for a lot of administrative rules, it's not a code. It's the regulations regarding the food production of whatever. And so in doing that, it almost would be too incomprehensible to add all that together. It's better to kind of break them down so you can organize it a little bit more clearly.
That makes sense.
Then we go to the regulated party. And so you can see right here in subsection D, it says every employer. So that's where we pull that out from and we put that into there. The retention.
Whereas in some cases it might say every specific type of employer, and that's where we get into the 88,000 or so, 81,000 regulated parties.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. For example, I mean, here we wanted to do something that was applicable to employers because that's a big target to hit. But you're right. There's for employers of certain industries, employers who use certain workers, employers of employees who are exposed to certain substances. These can be very granular and very specific, which is very helpful if you're looking for those types of codes.
Right.
And so, like as I mentioned before, we have the regulated party is found in subsection D, but when you move to subsection K, that's where you get the retention period from. And so you can see it says from the current calendar year and the preceding 3 calendar years in original form. And so in looking at that, that's kind of where that retention period comes from. And then we have the records description, which is also interesting from a granularity level because you can see that it says all tax returns and forms together with supporting records and schedules. Now, Warren, you mentioned before that sometimes from one law you can get a lot of citations. And so theoretically, if we wanted to, you could have different citations for each of those different types of document types. But what we try and do is make it something that is applicable and understandable from a standpoint of practical usability in practical business practice. So you're not usually dividing out all of these things separately or organizing all these things separately. They're usually kept in the same bucket. And so that's why we kind of pull all this together into this citation.
So again, a judgment call as to how detailed you get in that.
Yeah, because you also don't want to have 45 citations that all say the same thing.
Right.
When it's all dealing with the same bucket.
If we go back one piece, I also wanted to highlight the fact that when we carve out the retention period, we have in the kind of the shorthand version the CY plus 3, and I know that that's something that's somewhat unique in our system where every retention period has the trigger. So it doesn't just say 3 years. We're saying it's specifically 3 years after either the creation date, the calendar year, some event, et cetera. And I think that's important to distinguish because sometimes that can be ambiguous.
That's right. And I think that it's important to point out a lot of times that there are very distinct and different triggers. You might have duration of employment. You might have the creation of a certain document. So there's a lot of different ways that those can be played out, and it can cause different analyses of this record retention statute.
Excellent. So yeah, it's a good summary of kind of the pieces that we pull out and put into the database. And that's always, again, a judgment call. It's kind of a nuance as to how do you know what to include, what not to. And I think the next part we want to take a look at is kind of how that might show in the actual software. So this is just a quick screenshot of that same citation, how it plays out in the desktop version of the versatile system, where it shows at the top there the the heading, the identifier, and then all of those other details as far as the regulated party, description, statuses, dates. We have, I highlighted there the text part of it, which shows the actual text of the law. The general tab would include the headers. But I think one of the things that's key here too is that we've got all that text there in the database, so it's all searchable, versus saying having a link to a website where that link may change, it may break. So I know that's one of the things that we try to provide for the users to make sure that it's completely searchable.
Yeah, exactly.
And kind of in adding to that, just one more screen here as far as what the tools that we give you to do a search on that. So this is just showing how you can do a search like on part of the identifier if you want to. You can include the jurisdiction, you can include the business activity to narrow the results, because that's where we've already carved this out as being somewhat tax related. So all of those different types of filters can really help you narrow down the scope of what you're looking for and get right to what you need.
Yeah, and I find that really useful when you're trying to find, first of all, a specific law, but if you're trying to get a wide breadth, because I think one of the hardest things, again, is that this answer is not necessarily, I mean, we've jokingly said this is the answer, but there's a whole lot of other components that come into this. And so, you're going to want to be able to look at a breadth of different things in the tax codes in this certain area of New York law to be able to contextualize what you're actually looking at and the decision you need to make with the specific records that you're talking about.
Yeah, excellent point. With that, I think we should take another poll, get some feedback from the audience. And in this case, let me share the next poll question. And this is about what you use currently to maintain your record-keeping citations. I'm kind of curious to find out what everyone else is using. So we'll give that a few moments and see what the results look like. This is really our market research. So we lured you into this webinar just to find out what you're doing. No, that's not true, but it is a curious question just to kind of see what's happening with that. Got just over half of the results in, so we'll wait just a few more moments and get a few more in there. Interesting, it's going to have some that are quite close. Let's see where that plays out. All right, I think we've got the quorum here, so I'll go ahead and close that, share the results. So there you have it. Most people are using spreadsheets. No surprise there, right? The good old spreadsheets are the workhorse of the business world. But several using commercial applications, databases, online government resources, and then kind of the rest in the other category. So yeah, good to know. Yeah, that does not surprise me. I was kind of curious to see how many might play out in that commercial application space. All right, with that, let's talk about some of the common issues and obstacles. So let me close the polling screen here. And of course, there's no shortage of issues that come up when you're doing all this work. We've kind of hinted at some of that already. There's no easy button. So maybe, Jake, you can walk us through some of the issues that come up whenever you're doing this kind of work. We'll start with the maintenance, that is just kind of keeping this information up to date.
Yeah, I think that's always going to be the biggest challenge that you have, because laws are constantly changing. They're constantly being interpreted in different ways. And so I think in the records retention sphere, it's not as volatile as some of the other laws that you might have, but just constantly making sure that what you're relying upon to make those important decisions is up to date and relevant can be a task. I mean, in thinking about, one of the things we didn't talk about with primary and secondary sources is that while a lot of those are free to access on the internet, some are not.
Yeah.
Some you have to pay for. And so in thinking about the cost of continually upkeeping, even just having Westlaw, if that's what you decide to use, that can be fairly pricey. And so understanding the cost of that, the upkeep of that, translation costs for certain types of laws. If you need to understand them,
Hmm.
that can be a costly venture as well. And so something that we try and do is consistently update and review, especially laws that we know that are changing frequently or are high use by our clients, to make sure that the information they have is as up to date and as relevant as is possible.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so then the other issue that we talked about a little bit before, but is the granularity of the text, what to leave in, what to leave out. If we go back to the example that we've been talking about, you can see that there's obviously a lot of text in here that some of it we pulled and copied over wholesale. For example, the identifier that is directly there. But when we talk about in looking at the record description, for example, instead of doing two different, this is just going to be kind of discussing how we made this citation, but instead of breaking this out and saying subsection D is a citation and subsection K is a different citation, we understand contextually that K is informing D, that they're both parts of the same whole. And so in the record description, we describe that, and then you can see, and maybe it's a little hard to see, but in the slide at the very end in brackets, it gives a description of what those actual forms and returns that are referenced in subsection D are. And it notes that that's where the retention period comes from. So it's tricky because, again, we don't want to copy the text of the citation or the law wholesale into every single citation, because then it's no better than just going and reading the law yourself.
Yeah, we could just dump all this into a bucket and let you search it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We could just charge people for what they can already find free online. But
Yeah.
the real special element here is the refinement to say, here's what we have seen is relevant and what our clients feel is relevant over years of experience and understanding what is really important with what text to actually use.
Yeah, I can see where going through a lot of these would really help to inform how you make those judgment calls.
Exactly. And so in some of the other issues, and this is a lot of contextual stuff that I feel like informs the law and kind of what we talked about at the very beginning when you're talking about statutes of limitation. So when can people bring lawsuits against you regarding these specific laws? That sometimes can be a very, very important factor into how long you keep records. But sometimes it's not. You can't just say, well, because we're going to be sued on this, then we're going to keep it for this long. Because if you're never actually sued over that issue, that's not really reasonable. But if that is an area in which you face a lot of litigation, then that could actually, you might retain something for longer than what the requirement says, because you know that that's going to be more beneficial towards your business practice.
Oh, interesting. So the type of business will sometimes determine whether a statute of limitation applies.
Yes, because
Interesting.
there's a whole slew of statutes of limitation. You can be sued for pretty much anything. But the question is whether or not you have a high probability of those lawsuits occurring. Because otherwise, and I think sometimes you might feel this from legal, which is, well, let's just throw everything on a hard drive and keep it for forever, because you never know. We could be sued, when having all this information is helpful. But one of the issues that we're seeing more and more is the pushback of privacy regulations.
Yeah.
So I feel like records management has gone from how do we protect paper to how do we get paper into electronic form and keep it forever. And now it's how are we making sure we're getting rid of privacy related data that isn't going to come back to bite us in a different way later.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when
I've
we're
seen the
talking
same.
about, yeah, when we're talking about conditional retention, sometimes in the regulations themselves, there is a judgment call as to whether or not it applies, or it might just be guidance. And so conditionally, whether or not you do that, you may have conflicting requirements where you may, especially if you're an organization that works out of multiple jurisdictions, it's extremely common to have differing regulation periods that apply. And so looking to the citations to say, okay, which one will apply here, or even within a citation itself, it may seem like there's some conflicting requirements or in that. And so again, as a lawyer, the favorite answer is it depends. But that comes into play.
So that's where it
And then
comes into interpretation, right?
exactly interpreting the requirements. And if we go back to our example as kind of an illustrative um, demonstration, you can see the records retention statute for what we've been dealing with today is fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. Employers keep these records for this long. On the right, I've pulled a citation that's talking about the retention dealing with medical studies. And in reading this, and you don't have to read through it all, but it's each one of those subsections sets forth a different retention period depending on how those studies and specimens are used. So
So
if
each
it's
of these
this,
sections here, you're saying.
exactly. So the first one talks about the retention is the period of the marketing and research permit. If it's just submitted for the EPA, but it's not actually approved, then it's 5 years, which is subsection 2. And then in all other situations where you just have a study, but it's not submitted, then it's 2 years. And depending on the client, they may have that kind of organization or granularity as to here are the studies and that fall into each one of these boxes. But more typically, they're just going to say, how long do we need to keep these for the longest? And let's just put them all in that bucket. Like the bigger bucket approach is more efficient in some regards. But again, it just goes back to what is the practice? What is your business practice? What is your business need? And the citations allow you to look at all this. Like for example, in our database, this citation is set forth in 3 different citations, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
code in the trigger that allows you to know that there are other applicable sections here. So you can very quickly look at it and say, okay, here's one element. I'm going to look at the other 3 or the other 2 and be able to draw those together and contextualize what we're talking about.
That's a great example. Yeah, those get pretty wild when you're trying to, make it very simple. There's just areas that can't be simplified.
Yeah. So again, there's other things like regional terminology. Some things are referenced in different ways in different jurisdictions. Cost of resources is something I already talked about a little bit, that just actually upkeeping all of these resources, if you have to deal in multiple jurisdictions, can be very costly. And then finally, the delivery, like how is this put forth? And the poll question was very illustrative. We have
Hmm.
spreadsheets, databases. There's a whole bunch of different ways that these are delivered, but how do you deliver it in a way that is easily accessible, referenceable, and understandable? So
Yeah, and in that part of it, I know, in trying to keep this data organized in our system, just dealing with duplicates is a huge issue because they're not always cited consistently. And so it's hard to sometimes know, oh, has that law been repealed, or is that referencing something different, because it might have the first part of the identifier the same, but might be a different subsection. And so that gets pretty tricky as well to know that you're citing the right things.
yeah, exactly.
So I think that we can take all of this, and I know that we could have spent another 2 hours on all the nuances of those. I feel like we kind of had to go through those pretty quickly, but I think we can boil this down into some key themes here that deal with those intricacies that you highlighted in several of those slides, which just kind of highlights the quality of the research and what that means for your business practices. So some of those, I think, that came out in these slides is the context. You have to know the business context of the rules that you're dealing with. It's not black and white. You have to interpret how that's going to apply and what impact that might have on the records that you're going to apply those citations to. And then in addition, the consistency, making sure that it's structured in a way that is consistent with regard to how we cite jurisdictions, dates, the identifiers. Imagine trying to search for things that are updated in a certain year, but you've got different ways that you display or store the year. You may not get the results that you want. So having that consistency really does make a big difference when it comes to searching and reporting. And then I think just the confidence in terms of not just gathering the information and presenting it, but having had to apply it to retention schedules and then be scrutinized by the business side, by attorneys, by regulators, and be questioned about how that actually works, and seeing people actually apply it to the records and destroy things. Going through that for a few decades here now gives us the confidence that yes, we've gone through that drill before. We know that it's it's applicable. We know it's defensible. I think that plays into this a lot as well. And then the coverage, having the all the jurisdictions, the different countries, understanding how it works out as far as the different restrictions in each country, the translation issues, regional differences, just having experience in that makes a big difference as well in terms of trusting the information that we're presenting. And then finally, just as you mentioned earlier, keeping it current. It's hard to overstate the importance of that, because it's so easy for these laws to get behind and out of date. And we're now updating like every 1 to 2 weeks. So it's not going just every few months. We've got a lot of things happening on a regular basis here. So with that, we're almost out of time, but we do want to see if there are any questions. We've got maybe time for one question, and then the rest we will go ahead and respond to by email. So Jerry, is there any question that we can answer in the moment that we have left here?
Yeah, we received a couple, so thank you, everybody. If a company has multiple business lines in multiple states, is it defensible to retain records for 10 years in accordance with the statute of limitations for the False Claims Act?
That's definitely a legal question.
That's definitely a legal question, and it's almost too legal for us. I think that could be a defensible. Again, that could be. There's, as I mentioned before, there's a whole different range of reasons why you may or may not decide to retain documents for a certain period, and so that definitely is one that is plausible and believable. I think you're always trying to just figure out what's the way that is going to be most defensible from a legal standpoint, and so that's a great question for legal to answer and to figure out. But that's definitely one of could be correct answers. But yeah, looking at the statute of limitations for that, I think is a great place to start.
And I do apologize for not allowing more time for the questions. I've got a hard stop at the top of the hour for another call that I'll be on, but we will answer those additional questions by email to get back to you on those. And then just a quick highlight that we've got a virtual coffee coming up on March 14th, 9 o'clock Mountain Time, dealing with privacy as a retention schedule and program foundation. So be sure and check that out. And if you've got any questions for us in addition, you can email us at consulting@zasio.com, and we've got a phone number there as well. And of course, we've got our website, and you can reach us there also. Thanks again, Jake, for your participation, all the research you did on this. Thanks everyone for participating, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Warren. Bye.